She told me college was a waste of money. She said I'd end up working for someone smarter. Turns out that someone was me. That line still echoes in my head sometimes, not as anger anymore, but as proof. Back then, it felt like the kind of sentence that could end a dream. I was 17, sitting at the kitchen table with college brochures spread out in front of me like a battlefield. My mother stood by the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled like onions and bitterness. She didn't look up when she said it, just tossed the words out like they were nothing. "You don't need college, Emily. You need to be realistic." Realistic. That was her favorite word. It meant small. It meant stay where you are. My father didn't argue. He never did. He just nodded from his recliner, eyes glued to the TV. "Your mom's right," he said. "We don't have the money for that kind of thing anyway." I remember looking at the brochures, bright colors, dorm rooms, smiling faces, and feeling something close in my chest. Like someone was quietly locking a door I hadn't even walked through yet. I got a job instead. My first one was at a diner off the highway. 6 a.m. shifts, the smell of coffee soaked into my uniform. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd save up and apply again later. But months turned into years, and the rhythm of survival started to sound a lot like routine. Mom liked to remind me I was lucky to have steady work. She'd say it every time I came home tired, counting tips at the table. "You see?" she'd say, smiling like she was right about everything. "No college debt, no stress. You're doing fine." But fine never felt like enough. Not when I'd see old classmates post about graduation, first apartments, careers. I used to scroll through their photos at night, feeling that familiar twist of envy and shame. Still, I kept working. Double shifts, holidays, overtime whenever they offered. I learned how to budget, how to fix things on my own, how to make a dollar stretch until it snapped. Then one day, something changed. A new customer started coming in, an older woman named Mrs. Lawson. She was kind, quiet, always ordered the same thing. Eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. But she noticed things. The way I refilled everyone's cups before they asked. The way I remembered their orders by heart. One morning, she asked, "You ever think about doing something else?" I almost laughed. "Like what?" I said. College didn't really work out. She just smiled. "You don't need college to learn how to invest." That was the first time I heard someone talk about money. Like it was something you could control. Not something that controlled you. Mrs. Lawson told me she owned a few rental properties around town. Nothing fancy, just duplexes and small homes. She said she started small too. "You'd be surprised what people overlook when they think you don't know much," she told me. "That's how you win quietly." After that, I started reading everything I could about real estate, between shifts, during lunch breaks, late at night when the diner smell still clung to my hair. I learned about FHA loans, down payments, credit scores, interest rates. Words that used to sound impossible became tools. And the funny part? My credit was spotless. Because while my mom spent years mocking my ambition, I'd spent just as long paying every bill on time. It took 3 years before I made my first move. A small duplex on the edge of town, peeling paint, leaky roof, but cheap. I used an FHA loan, scrimped every penny for the down payment, and signed the papers with shaking hands. The realtor smiled and said, "Congratulations, homeowner." I almost cried right there. I didn't tell my parents. I just started fixing the place up quietly on weekends, painting, replacing light fixtures, patching drywall. The first time I collected rent, it felt surreal, like I'd crossed into a life I wasn't supposed to have. But secrets like that don't stay hidden forever. One Sunday, I stopped by my parents' house for dinner, something I rarely did anymore. My mom was in one of her moods, complaining about rent increases. "The new landlord's greedy," she said, stabbing her fork into her plate. "Raise the rent again. People like that shouldn't even be allowed to own property." I almost smiled. Not out of cruelty, but irony. Because the house she was talking about was mine. See, when I bought that duplex, the tenants in one unit had just moved out. The other was still occupied by my parents. I didn't know it until the papers were signed. I stared at the rental address on the contract the day I closed and felt my stomach drop. For a second, I thought about backing out. But then I realized maybe fate had finally decided to return the balance. That dinner was surreal. She kept talking about that landlord while I sat across from her, quietly paying attention to every word. "You should have gone to college," she said suddenly, changing the subject like she always did. "You're smart, but you wasted your time. You could have been something by now." I looked at her, at the same woman who told me to be realistic, to stop dreaming, and felt something shift. Not anger, just clarity. "Maybe I still could," I said softly. She laughed. "At your age? Don't be ridiculous," but I didn't argue. I didn't tell her the truth. Some truths are too poetic to waste on people who can't hear them yet. That night, I went home and sat at my kitchen table, looking at the rent check that had just cleared, the one with my mother's neat handwriting on the memo line. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closure, written in ink. Over the next few months, I renovated the other unit, rented it out, and started saving for another property. The work was exhausting, but every nail I hammered, every wall I painted, felt like building my own voice, one they could never silence again. One day, my mom called. "You wouldn't believe it," she said, her tone irritated. "The landlord sent a notice. He's increasing rent again." I paused, pretending to think. "Maybe it's just market value," I said. "Market value, my foot," she snapped. "People like that take advantage of others. Always chasing money," I smiled to myself. "Maybe they're just trying to build something for themselves," she sighed. "You sound just like them." I didn't say it out loud, but inside I thought, exactly. Sometimes justice doesn't look like confrontation. It looks like a quiet transaction. A name on a deed. A check written without knowing who it's to. That night, I wrote a note in my journal, just one line, but it felt like the beginning of a story I'd finally earned the right to tell. She said I didn't need college. She was right. I just needed her rent, and for the first time in my life, I slept like someone who owned the roof above her head, and the story beneath it. My mother always had a way of turning pride into shame. It wasn't enough for her to disagree with my choices. She had to dress it up as wisdom. Whenever I visited, she'd slip in those little jabs wrapped in laughter. "You still at that diner?" she'd ask like it was a joke. "You're such a hard worker, and you could have made a great secretary if you'd just gone to business school." I'd smile, nod, let her think she was right. It was easier that way. I learned early that arguing with her never changed anything. She needed to be right, more than she needed to be kind. There were moments, though, when her words cut deep enough to leave bruises I couldn't show. Like the time she introduced me to a family friend as the one who stayed behind. She said it so casually, like I was a misplaced item instead of her daughter. "The one who stayed behind," she repeated, laughing as if it were harmless. I smiled through it, but inside something small and tired curled up and stopped breathing. That was her favorite kind of cruelty, soft-spoken, plausible, deniable. The truth was, I didn't visit much anymore. Not because I hated her, but because I finally understood what peace felt like when she wasn't around. My own apartment, the one I owned, was quiet. Clean. Mine. I'd wake up on Sundays, make coffee, and look out the window at the small world I was slowly building. The air smelled like independence and paint thinner. I was saving for another property then, reading books about real estate taxes and passive income. Sometimes I'd wonder what my life might have been if she'd supported me when I was younger. But then I'd think, maybe I wouldn't have learned how to save myself. One afternoon, while reviewing rent receipts, I noticed my mother's payment had been late. It wasn't much, just a week behind, but something in me hesitated before calling her. When I did, she answered with that familiar tone, half irritation, half disbelief. "Late?" she said. "I sent it last week." I opened the portal on my laptop. "It hasn't come through yet," I said gently. "Maybe it just hasn't cleared." There was silence on the line, then a low sigh. "These landlords," she muttered, not realizing I was the one she was talking about. "Always making a fuss over a few days." I wanted to tell her. I wanted to say, "Mom, I'm not just a waitress anymore. I'm the one keeping a roof over your head." But I didn't. Not yet. The next few months blurred into a cycle of quiet progress. I bought my second property, a small cottage across town. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friends. Success feels sacred when you've built it alone. I kept my diner job, too. People didn't understand why. "You don't need to keep working there," my coworker Jenna said one night while we were closing up. "You've got 2 houses. Why not quit?" I smiled. "Because that job reminds me where I came from, and what I never want to go back to." Around Christmas, my parents invited me for dinner. I almost said no, but something in me wanted to see how far I'd come. Not to show off, but to remind myself of the distance. The same kitchen, the same flickering light above the table. Mom was cooking roast chicken, humming off-key. My dad greeted me with a tired smile. "You still at that diner?" he asked. I nodded. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Hard worker, just like your mom." She turned from the stove. "Yeah, except I was smart enough not to chase big dreams." That's when I realized she wasn't mocking me because she hated me. She was mocking me because I was doing what she couldn't. My ambition reminded her of every chance she'd turned down, every excuse she'd made. I wasn't her disappointment. I was her reflection, and she couldn't stand it. I left early that night, driving home with the radio off, my mind quiet and sharp. The next morning, I opened my laptop and looked at my mother's rental file again. The payment had cleared, late, but there. I marked it as received and then sat there staring at her name for a long time. My own last name typed under tenant. Sometimes power doesn't roar. It whispers. Months passed. Spring came. The diner got busier, and so did I. My tenants were steady, the properties paid for themselves, and I was slowly building something bigger, a life my mother wouldn't even recognize. Then one afternoon, I stopped by the duplex to check the gutters. My mom was outside watering plants, wearing her faded robe and slippers. She didn't see me at first. I watched her for a moment, realizing that the woman who once called me a failure now lived in a house I repaired, under a roof I paid for. It wasn't triumph. It was bittersweet. Like winning a race against someone who never knew they were competing. When she did notice me, she waved. "What are you doing here?" she asked, surprised. "Just in the neighborhood," I said. She frowned. "You should visit more often." Her tone almost sounded kind. Almost. We talked for a few minutes about the weather, the neighborhood, the rising cost of groceries. "Our landlord's got it easy," she said suddenly. "Just collects checks and sits back." She laughed. "Must be nice," I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "Must be." That night I went home and looked through old boxes, photos, report cards, notes from school. There was one I found folded in half, yellowed at the edges. It was a scholarship application I'd started in high school. The top half was filled in neatly. The bottom half was blank. My mother's handwriting scrawled across the corner, "We can't afford this. Don't get your hopes up." I stared at it for a long time, remembering how I'd tucked it away quietly without arguing. That was the day I stopped asking for permission. Maybe that's when I started becoming the kind of woman who'd sign a mortgage instead of an application. A week later, I got another call from my mom. Her voice was tight. "They raised the rent again," she said. "Can you believe it? What kind of person does that?" I hesitated, then said softly, "Someone who learned how value works." She didn't understand what I meant. "Well, it's not fair," she muttered. "People like that always win." I smiled, staring at the deed on my desk. "Not always," I said. "Sometimes they just learn." After that call, I realized something simple but powerful. I didn't owe her an explanation. Not for my choices, not for my success, not even for the irony she lived under every month. The younger me would have wanted her approval. The woman I'd become only wanted peace. That night, I sat on my couch, opened my laptop, and started looking at listings for my third property. The glow of the screen lit up the room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Somewhere across town, my mother was probably complaining about her landlord again, and I didn't mind. Let her. Every story needs a villain in someone else's version. Because for once, I was the one writing the ending. Quietly, legally, completely on my own terms. By the time summer came, my life had changed in ways my mother couldn't even imagine. The diner still paid my bills, but it wasn't my main income anymore. Rent checks came in every month like clockwork, and for the first time, I wasn't counting the days between paydays. I'd wake up early, go for a walk before work, and feel something I hadn't felt since I was a kid. Freedom that didn't depend on anyone's approval. My mother used to say I'd always need someone to take care of me. She was wrong. I'd built something she couldn't control, and that, I think, scared her more than anything. It started small. Comments slipped into conversations, like pebbles tossed into clear water. "You're still renting that little apartment, right?" she'd ask. "You should save your money instead of wasting it." When I told her I owned it, she laughed, thinking I was joking. "Oh, please," she said. "People like us don't own things." I didn't correct her. I just smiled and let her stay comfortable in the version of me she could handle. There was power in her not knowing. A few weeks later, she called again, this time upset. "The landlord sent a notice," she said, her voice sharp. "They're raising the rent. Can you believe that?" I sat at my desk, the same desk where I'd signed the mortgage papers months ago. The irony made me want to laugh, but I kept my tone gentle. "Yeah, that's happening everywhere," I said. "It's just how the market is right now." She sighed dramatically. "People are greedy," she muttered. "They take advantage of hard-working families." I almost said I'm that landlord, but the words stayed behind my teeth. The truth was mine, and I wanted to keep it that way, at least for now. My coworker Jenna noticed I'd been quieter lately. "You okay?" she asked one afternoon while we refilled coffee pots. "You seem lighter, actually." I smiled. "Just thinking about my next move." She grinned. "Another property?" I didn't answer, but she laughed. "You're turning into one of those mystery success stories. The girl who never brags but always wins." I shrugged. "I'm just learning how to play the game they said I wasn't smart enough to play." My next investment was a small duplex near the college I never got to attend. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked through the empty rooms, walls echoing with the hum of my own footsteps. The smell of old books and dust filled the air, and I ran my hand along the windowsill. I thought of the day my mother told me, "College isn't for people like us." And now, years later, I was buying property 2 blocks from that very campus. Not for revenge, just for closure. Though maybe, in some quiet way, it was both. When the paperwork cleared, I took a drive past my mother's rental house. I wasn't supposed to, but curiosity pulled me there. The garden was overgrown, the paint chipping near the porch. It wasn't that she didn't care. She just never maintained things she didn't believe she owned. I parked a few houses away, watching her hang laundry in the backyard. She looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was age. Or maybe it was that for the first time I wasn't standing beneath her shadow. I sat there for a while, the hum of my car mixing with the soft rustle of fabric in the breeze. Then I left, quietly, like I always did. That night my phone buzzed. It was her. "You'll never guess who I ran into," she said. "Mrs. Heller, your old teacher? She asked if you ever did anything with your life." I froze. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. "I said you're still working that diner job," she replied proudly. "See? I tell people you're reliable. You stuck to your roots." My throat tightened. That was her way of saving face. pretending my success didn't exist so she wouldn't have to face what it meant. I could have corrected her. I could have said, "I own 3 properties, Mom. You rent from me." But instead, I said softly, "Thanks for telling her, Mom." She didn't hear the layers in my voice. She never did. A week later, a letter arrived at her house, a standard notice about lease renewals. I knew she'd call as soon as she opened it. She did. "They're renewing my lease, but the rent's higher again," she snapped. "Who are these people? Do they even care who lives here?" I took a slow breath. "Maybe they're just trying to keep up with expenses," I said. "It's not personal." She scoffed. "Everything's personal. Some people get ahead by stepping on others." The silence stretched between us, heavy and sharp. "Not everyone, Mom," I said quietly. "Some people just keep climbing." That was the first time I realized the truth. My success wasn't revenge. It was reflection. Every rent increase, every document with my name on it, was a mirror showing her what she'd chosen not to see. She wanted control. I wanted freedom. And freedom won quietly, without permission. One evening, while updating my spreadsheets, I noticed her name again. Tenant Mary Parker. For a moment, the letters blurred. My mother's name looked strange in that context, as if belonging to someone else. I closed my laptop and sat back, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of proving, of hiding, of carrying the weight of her disbelief. Maybe I thought it was time to let her know. Not to hurt her, but to stop pretending. The chance came sooner than I expected. She called one Sunday frustrated. "The dryer's broken," she said. "Can you come look at it?" I hesitated, then agreed. When I arrived, she was pacing the living room, phone in hand. "I swear that landlord never fixes anything," she muttered. "I'm calling him again." I watched her dial the number printed on the lease notice. My phone lit up with her incoming call. She froze when she saw me take it out of my pocket. The silence between us was a living thing. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered the phone. "What are you doing?" she whispered. I held up my screen, showing her the call. "Answering you," I said softly. For a second, her face didn't move. Then she blinked, confusion shifting into disbelief. "You?" she said, almost laughing. You're the landlord?" I nodded. "Have been for a while." She stepped back like she'd been pushed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I took a breath. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. You told me I didn't need college. You told me people like us don't own things. I just wanted to prove that wasn't true." Her eyes filled with something between pride and shame, a reflection she couldn't hide from anymore. She looked around the house, touching the walls she thought belonged to someone else. "So, this is yours?" she whispered. "Ours," I said quietly. "You're still my mom. You just live here now. Differently." She didn't answer. I fixed the dryer, said goodbye, and left. As I walked to my car, the evening sun hit the roof of the house just right, lighting it in gold. For years, she'd told me I wasn't smart enough, not ambitious enough, not like the others. But that day, she saw the truth, not in words, but in bricks, deeds, and silence. When I left her house that evening, I thought the silence between us would fade with time. But it didn't. It deepened. My mother didn't call for days, then weeks. I figured she needed space to process what she'd learned. After all, it wasn't just about rent or ownership. It was about the story she'd built her whole life around. The story that I was the one who didn't make it. And now that story had cracked in half. One Sunday morning, I got a message from my Aunt Ruth. "Heard your mom's been acting strange lately," she wrote. "Something happened between you two?" I stared at the text for a long time before replying. Not really, I typed back. Just, the truth caught up. She didn't respond. But I knew word would spread. In my family, silence is never private. I didn't mean for it to become gossip, but it did. My cousin Tessa called a few days later, curious. Wait, so your mom rents from you? She asked, half whispering like it was scandalous. I sighed. Yeah, for a while now. There was a pause, then a low laugh. Wow, guess the tables really turned, huh? I smiled, though it wasn't the kind of smile that reached my eyes. Something like that. By the next week, everyone seemed to know. My mom must have told someone, or maybe someone saw her reaction that day. Either way, the story grew its own legs. I heard she told one version to her church group, that she helped me buy the house. In another version, she said I'd gone behind her back. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was control, and she was scrambling to get some of it back. When she finally called again, her voice was flat. You embarrassed me, she said. You made me look like a fool. I sat at my desk, staring at my reflection in the dark laptop screen. Mom, I said quietly, I didn't do this to embarrass you. I did it to build a life. That's all I ever wanted, she exhaled sharply. You could have told me. You could have, I interrupted her gently. Would you have listened? There was silence. Then she hung up. After that, the air between us changed permanently. We spoke only about necessary things. Lease renewals, repairs, the kind of empty talk that fills the space where love used to live. I didn't push her, and she didn't apologize. We existed in a strange truce made of distance and unspoken truths. But deep down, something inside me had shifted too. I wasn't the girl trying to prove herself anymore. I didn't need her approval, or her understanding, or her validation. I'd already built my own version of success, and brick by brick, signature by signature. One evening, as I was leaving the diner, I saw a familiar face at the counter, Mrs. Heller, my old high school teacher. The same woman my mom had mentioned before. She smiled as I walked over. You look well, she said warmly. Your mother told me you're doing fine. I hesitated, then smiled back. I am, I said softly. Better than fine. She nodded, eyes kind. You always had potential. I'm glad you finally used it. I walked out into the cool night air, her words echoing in my mind. Finally used it. It wasn't the validation I needed, but it felt like closure, the kind that doesn't demand applause. That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee, scrolling through property listings again. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe because progress had become my peace. I found one, an old house near the lake, run down but beautiful underneath the neglect. The kind of place that just needed someone to believe in it again. The same way I once needed that. A few weeks later, I bought it. Quietly, no big announcement, no post. No phone call home. When my mom found out, and of course she did, she didn't call to congratulate me. She called to ask, how do you keep affording these things? I laughed softly. The same way I always did, I said. Hard work. And choices, she sighed. You always make it sound so easy. I wanted to tell her it wasn't. That every night I spent crying over bills, every time I ate ramen instead of dinner out, every time I walked home from the diner exhausted, it was all for this. But I didn't say that. Because explaining yourself to someone who doesn't want to understand only empties you out. Weeks passed. Our conversation stayed short, but something curious started happening. She began asking small questions. How's business? Are you renting that new place? Her tone softened each time, like she was testing the air between us. I answered politely. Never cruel, never smug, just steady. One night, she called while I was fixing a light in the kitchen. I've been thinking, she said slowly. Maybe I was wrong. About the college thing. I froze, screwdriver in hand. What do you mean? I asked. She hesitated. You did all right for yourself. Better than all right. It wasn't an apology, not really. But it was the closest she could manage. And somehow that was enough. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Thanks, Mom," I said softly. "That means something." We talked a bit longer that night, about the weather, about my dad, about things that didn't hurt. And when she hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace without resentment. The next morning, I opened my email and saw her rent payment had come through early. It was a small thing, but symbolic. Maybe it was her way of acknowledging the truth, of accepting that the girl she once underestimated had become the woman who made sure she was still safe. I didn't need her gratitude. I just needed the distance to heal what she never could. That weekend, I drove past her house again. The same one she used to call her home. This time, I didn't feel the ache of old wounds or the burn of quiet revenge. I just saw a house, a place that held history but not control. I smiled and kept driving, the wind in my hair, the sun in my rearview mirror. Some victories aren't loud. They're quiet, lived in, and paid monthly, like rent for peace. When Mom found out I owned the house, the silence lasted almost 2 weeks. For someone who had always filled space with noise, gossip, criticism, half-hearted advice, that quiet was louder than anything she'd ever said. It was a silence that carried disbelief, shame, and maybe, though she'd never admit it, a touch of pride. I didn't hear from her until the first of the month when the rent payment was due. Her text was short. "Can I bring the check over instead of mailing it?" I stared at it for a long time. It felt like an invitation, a test, and a confession all at once. When she showed up that evening, she had a plastic grocery bag in her hand. Inside was an envelope with the rent check, and next to it, a small Tupperware of her pot roast. The one she used to make every Sunday when things between us were still simple. She didn't say much at first, just looked around the place, the new paint, the repaired porch, the potted plants I'd added to the entryway. "You fixed it up nice," she said, her tone flat but her eyes softer than I expected. I could see the years on her face, the exhaustion, the quiet regret, the stubbornness that had kept her from ever saying sorry. We sat on the porch steps, the same ones she used to complain about when the wood was rotting. I could feel the weight of everything we'd never said pressing between us. She kept her eyes on the street when she spoke. "You know, I wasn't trying to stop you from doing better. I just didn't think you could handle being disappointed." I almost laughed. That was her way of saying she underestimated me, that she thought I was fragile when all I ever needed was faith. For a second, I wanted to throw every memory back at her, the nights she'd say I was wasting my time studying, the way she celebrated my brother's promotions but called my achievements luck. But I didn't. Because sitting there, I realized something that shocked me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to win her approval or her apology. I had already built a life that proved both were unnecessary. I told her I didn't buy the house to hurt her. I bought it because I wanted to take care of something that once felt like mine. I wanted to rewrite the story, to build instead of break. She nodded slowly, then said, almost under her breath, "You really did make something out of yourself." That was the closest thing to "I'm proud of you" I was ever going to get. And for the first time, it was enough. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet of the house. The light from the window fell across the old hardwood floors, the same ones I used to sweep as a teenager, dreaming of leaving. I thought about how strange it was that life had brought me back here, not as the girl desperate to be seen, but as the woman who finally saw herself clearly. A few weeks later, my brother called. He said Mom had been talking about me nonstop, telling everyone how I'd become some big business owner. He said she sounded proud, though in her own roundabout way. That night, I scrolled through my phone and found an old text thread. Messages I'd sent her years ago, asking for advice, for a little belief. They were all unanswered. I deleted them without hesitation. That chapter was over. The next time I saw her, she was sitting in her car outside the house, waiting to hand me the next month's rent. But when I walked up to the window, she handed me a folded piece of paper instead. It was a handwritten note. "I don't know if I was a good mother," it said. but I'm trying to be better. Thank you for not giving up." There was no signature, just her familiar handwriting. Slanted, messy, rushed. I tucked it into my wallet, not because I needed proof, but because I knew how hard it must have been for her to write it. Over the next few months, our relationship became something new, fragile, tentative, but real. We didn't pretend that the past hadn't happened. We just stopped using it as a weapon. She started calling me sometimes, asking for small favors, how to use her online banking app, how to save photos from her phone. They were small, ordinary things, but each one was an unspoken truce. One evening, she invited me over for dinner. The same house she now rented from me felt smaller, warmer somehow. She served the pot roast again, and this time we ate in silence that didn't hurt. I noticed she'd framed one of my old graduation photos on the mantel. The same photo she once refused to hang because she said college didn't matter that much. As I drove home that night, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. Peace doesn't come from proving someone wrong. It comes from not needing to anymore. Owning that house wasn't revenge. It was redemption. It was proof that I could create stability from the same ground where I was once told I'd fail. That I could love, forgive, and still protect my boundaries. Now, every time I get the rent payment reminder on my phone, I smile. Not because of the money, but because it reminds me how far I've come. My mother once told me I didn't need college. Maybe she was right. Maybe what I really needed was belief in myself, and I finally found it. The months turned into a quiet rhythm, rent checks, short conversations, small efforts at rebuilding something we both once thought was gone forever. I stopped expecting apologies that would never come, and she stopped pretending that what happened hadn't left a mark. We existed somewhere between forgiveness and acceptance, not rewriting the past, just learning how to walk beside it without tripping. Every Sunday, I drove by the house, not out of obligation, but out of habit. The front porch looked the same, except for the flowers she'd planted in recycled coffee cans. They were bright and uneven, the way her love had always been, clumsy, imperfect, but growing anyway. Sometimes I'd park across the street and just sit there, thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who begged for validation in a house that gave her everything but belief. That girl would have never imagined she'd own the place one day, that her strength would become the foundation her mother lived on. I remember the first time I told someone at work about it. It slipped out casually during lunch. "Oh, my tenant's check came in late." They asked who it was, and when I said my mom, they froze for a second, unsure whether to laugh or look sorry. I smiled and said, "It's okay. Life's funny like that." Because it was. It was strange and tender and brutally ironic in the way only real life can be. Around Christmas, she invited me over again. The house smelled like cinnamon and detergent, her favorite scent combination. There was a small tree by the window, decorated with the same ornaments from my childhood. She handed me a gift, wrapped awkwardly in old newspaper. Inside was a keychain that said, "Home is who you become." She'd bought it from a dollar store, but it might as well have been gold. We sat down, ate together, and for the first time in years, she asked me about my life, not just the surface-level things, but real questions. How work was going, whether I'd been seeing anyone, if I was happy. I told her yes, mostly. Happiness wasn't something I chased anymore. It was something that found me in moments like this. Quiet dinners, unspoken forgiveness, the sound of peace filling spaces once crowded with pain. When I drove home that night, snow had just started to fall. The world felt softer. I thought about the way she used to tell me that college doesn't guarantee happiness, and how maybe, in her own flawed way, she was right. Because happiness hadn't come from a diploma or a paycheck. It had come from standing on my own, and finally knowing I was enough. In the months that followed, I decided to sell the house. It wasn't out of bitterness, but release. I'd already built my new life, a small apartment near the lake, with plants that actually stayed alive and windows that caught the morning sun just right. When I told her, she didn't protest. She just said, I hope the new owner takes care of it the way you did. I nodded. They will, I said. Because I did. The day I signed the sale papers, I stood in the empty living room one last time. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and history. My footsteps echoed, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest or a ghost. I felt like closure. I thought about every version of myself that had lived there. The insecure teenager, the angry college dropout, the woman who came back not to prove a point, but to find peace. And as I closed the door behind me, I whispered a quiet goodbye, not just to the house, but to the version of me who needed to be seen by someone else to feel worthy. I see her now, my mother, not as the villain of my story, but as a flawed woman who did the best she could with what she knew. Her voice still echoes sometimes, reminding me of the day she said, "You don't need college." And she was right. I didn't need college. I needed courage. Now every time I walk past that street, I don't feel bitterness. I feel something softer. The kind of peace that comes when you've stopped waiting for an apology and started living like you deserve one. My story isn't about revenge. It's about returning to the same ground where I once felt small and standing tall enough to bless it on my way out. Because sometimes, the sweetest kind of justice isn't making someone pay. It's making yourself free.